मैं केवल तुम्हारे लिए गा रही हूँ, मैं केवल तुम्हारे लिए गा रही हूँ। क्षितिज पार की नील झंकार बनकर मैं सतरंग सरगम लिए आ रही हूँ, लिए आ रही हूँ। मैं केवल तुम्हारे लिए गा रही हूँ, मैं केवल तुम्हारे। सुनो मीत मेरे कि मैं गीत ज्वाला तुम्हारे लिए हूँ, मैं स्वर का उजाला। सुनो मीत मेरे कि मैं गीत ज्वाला तुम्हारे लिए हूँ, मैं स्वर का उजाला। मैं लौ बन के जल जल, मैं लौ बन के जल जल जिए जा रही हूँ, जिए जा रही हूँ। मैं केवल तुम्हारे लिए गा रही हूँ, मैं केवल तुम्हारे। मैं स्वर ताल लय की हूँ लवलीन सरिता, मैं अनचिन्ह अनजाने कवि की हूँ कविता। मैं स्वर ताल लय की हूँ लवलीन सरिता, मैं अनचिन्ह अनजाने कवि की हूँ कविता। जो तुम हो वो मैं हूँ, जो तुम हो वो मैं हूँ, ये बतला रही हूँ, ये बतला रही हूँ। मैं केवल तुम्हारे लिए गा रही हूँ, मैं केवल तुम्हारे लिए गा रही हूँ। क्षितिज पार की नील झंकार बनकर मैं सतरंग सरगम लिए आ रही हूँ, लिए आ रही हूँ। मैं केवल तुम्हारे लिए गा रही हूँ, मैं केवल तुम्हारे लिए गा रही हूँ।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. This melodious song in the melodious voice of Arunima, who was accompanied by her brother Aditya on the guitar, was about exclusive devotion to the divine, about doing whatever we do exclusively for the divine. मैं केवल तुम्हारे लिए गा रही हूँ. I am singing only for you, exclusively for you. This reminds me of that enigmatic statement which is often made in integral yoga, that the yoga should be for the divine, not for man. enigmatic because it appears that does it exclude service to mankind? Can the love for the divine not be expressed by expressing our love to God's creation? That is not what is implied. What is implied is that when we are doing something for mankind, for our fellow beings, that should also be with the full awareness that these human beings are a manifestation of the divine, and therefore we are actually doing it for the divine in these fellow beings. The difference that it makes is that if we do it with the idea of doing something for our fellow beings, it gives us that egoistic feeling of helping them. And who are we to help them? The divine is there to take care of each one of us. And therefore, all that we are doing is making some use, not necessarily always the best use, of the qualities, the accomplishments, the gifts and talents that we have received from the divine and the circumstances that we have received from the divine. We are making some use of that to fulfill the purpose of our life, because by what we do, we hope to grow spiritually, and that is the very purpose of life. And therefore, if we do it with this awareness, the yoga is for the divine, not for man, and that is what takes this egoistic feeling away. Another spin off of this attitude is that it avoids the type of frustration that might come if we do it out of a sense of helping somebody. Because we find that generally, as a result of this help, the problems that we seek to solve do not actually disappear. Not only that, those whom we think we are helping may not be grateful enough. Sometimes they may even turn against us. In fact, the greater the role in trying to help, apparently to help, greater is the possibility that they will turn against us. As happened with Jesus Christ, those whom he was trying to save were the ones who rewarded him with the cross. So that's what Sri Aurobindo also mentions at a few points in Savitri, that hard is the world redeemer's task. And the payment for the crown, that is the payment for promising the kingdom of the divine, the reward for that from mankind is the cross. So it saves us from that sort of a frustration. And because neither the problems get solved, nor are those whom we think we are helping grateful enough. And therefore, the yoga is for the divine. When we are trying to give, when we are trying to express our love by giving something to those who need it, it is to the divine in them. It is looking at them as a manifestation of the divine that we do it. And the only gain that is guaranteed 100% is that we would grow spiritually, we would end up fulfilling the purpose of our lives. With that, now we turn to today's topic, which is the physiology of the pregnant woman. And this is again one of those remarkable feats of the divine, how starting with a single cell, a microscopic speck, we end up in a relatively short period. 9 months is too short a period to accomplish that miracle. We end up with a 3-kilo bundle of joy within 9 months, starting with a microscopic speck. Not only it grows, it also differentiates into various organs. And it is amazing that in spite of all the miniature scale with which we start, and the miniature scale at which this blueprint is available in the genes, we end up with a product that is as perfect as it is at the end of these 9 months. The organs are all well formed. The limbs are well formed. The person is bilaterally symmetrical. Both sides develop equally well. And the complicated heart has its partitions and valves at the right place. Now, all these things are, in fact, truly amazing. And we should just touch the surface of this process today when we talk about pregnancy. With this, I go to the slides. Yep. The PowerPoint is open, but somehow I don't see it to select it. Let me try again.
Maybe you can just close few folders and then when you click on the share, you will see the PPT there.
Okay. Well, there's no folder really open apart from the. Still, it doesn't come. It's in basic, no? I can
Yes,
see the screen as it was before sharing, and the whiteboard and the iPhone pad. That's all I can see. The
So you can maybe then try share screen and then run the PPT if you cannot see the PPT.
yes, I went to share screen,
Yes.
and when I get what I get is just this myself and the whiteboard and the iPhone pad.
Okay, so if you're
And
getting yourself in the upper left corner, you'll see screen. You just click on the screen. So your entire
okay,
screen will be shown and then you can run the PPT.
okay, thank you.
Now you can just run the PPT.
Now I go to the PPT.
Yeah, you can do that.
Okay, thank you. Now I can go to the full screen. Okay. Is it okay now?
Yes, it's okay.
I think should be able to see this. This course and the just for recapitulation, the system with the ovaries where the eggs are formed, the egg which will be fertilized by the sperm to lead to the beginning of the baby. And this is the tube through which the egg travels, even otherwise, but particularly after fertilization. And after fertilization, this journey becomes important. It travels to the uterus where it will eventually grow into the baby. Now, this is the ovary, and we can see the development of the egg starting with these primitive cells, which divide and differentiate finally into the egg here, which surrounded by a few other cells is expelled from the ovary, and what remains behind develops into the corpus luteum, which then secretes those hormones which carry further the preparation of the uterus for a pregnancy which might occur. And if it doesn't, then it just winds up and ends up as this corpus albicans. It's scar sort of a thing. And the hormones are withdrawn because the corpus luteum has wound up, it has dismantled. And so the uterus also starts dismantling all the preparation that had been made for the guest that might arrive. Now, today we'll talk about the situation in which the guest does actually arrive. And now here is the egg, which has traveled part of the way in the fallopian tube. And at the right time, the male spermatozoa, the sperms, have been delivered. Now, out of a few million sperm that are delivered at a time, we find that only a few hundred are able to travel upstream through the vagina and reach the tube where the egg actually is. And which are these few hundred? Probably the healthiest and the strongest ones, because they have to swim against the current. And we shall talk more about it in detail when we talk about the male reproductive system. But perhaps the best are the strongest, and therefore perhaps the best ones are selected. So some sort of a selection takes place here, which would ensure better quality of the child that would be born. Now, out of a few hundred that reach here, again, there's only one lucky one that actually is able to get into the egg and fertilize the egg. And after one has entered, there seems to be a mechanism which will prevent a second one from entering the cell. So the rest are all left in the lurch. They are frustrated and they're not allowed to enter. So that mechanism for shutting the door to the rest after one has entered is also ensured in this process of fertilization. Now here's a microscopic view of the fertilized egg. This is the sperm that has just entered the egg with its head and a long tail. You can see part of the tail here. So this shows a little more of the process. The egg shed from the ovary, traveling in the fallopian tube, and then getting fertilized here by the sperm, and then traveling further. And while it is traveling, it doesn't sit idle. Gets into the process right away, and it's a very hard-working guest. It doesn't treat itself to the luxury of being received so well. It gets to work straight away and starts dividing, because unless we have a starting quota of a few cells, we will not have enough material for these cells to differentiate into different organs. And that process starts right in this tube. And it's after about 3 days that it reaches the uterus. And in another 3 days, it has started implanting itself at a point in the uterine wall. So this is where it will get fixed. And this process of getting fixed here, attaching itself here, is what we call implantation. So at the end of about 1 week after fertilization, it has started getting implanted here. Now, while it is dividing in the tube and while getting implanted, it first divides into 2 identical cells, then 2 become 4, 4 become 8, 8 becomes 16, and finally it becomes a ball of cells. But then as it divides, the cells that result from this division are smaller in size, with the result that the size of the fertilized egg hardly changes. The fertilized egg is called the zygote. So the size remains the same as that of the zygote or the fertilized egg, but now the number of cells has increased considerably. So it's just a ball of small sized cells, and then begin the initial stages of differentiation. You can see a cavity formed here and the cells migrating to this side. So that process has also begun. Now, this ball of cells is now trying to get implanted in the wall of the uterus. This is the wall of the uterus where it is trying to attach itself. And of course, the entire uterine wall is well prepared for it. There's a red carpet welcome waiting for this guest. And then the guest, like a hardworking guest, gets into the job. I mean, it doesn't treat itself like a guest. It works together with the host to not only get attached here, to implant itself here, but also to start cooking the food. So what it does is to digest a part of the uterine wall to create that soup, which will now provide the nourishment to the growing baby. We're calling it a baby, although it hardly looks like a baby. We still call it only an embryo. So this embryo has to have a food supply, and it starts manufacturing its food. It participates in manufacturing the food by dissolving. Sometimes we call it digesting, because there's a breakdown that takes place here to create some sort of a soup, which will then nourish the zygote. Not only it nourishes the zygote, it also starts producing an important hormone which is the basis of the pregnancy test. We shall see that in a moment. And what that hormone does, which works like the luteinizing hormone, is to ensure that the corpus luteum will not wind up. Normally the corpus luteum winds up a week, starts winding up about a week after the ovulation, and by 2 weeks, it has wound itself up completely, and then begins the menstruation. Now here, that will not happen, because this starts working like the luteinizing hormone, keeps the corpus luteum intact, so that the corpus luteum will continue to produce those hormones, which will further make this uterine wall more hospitable. And because of that, the ovulation will not take place in the next cycle. The uterus will just continue to be in that pregnant state as it was at the beginning of soon after ovulation. It will continue to be in that state, and in fact develop further in the same direction. So it not only creates this soup, which will serve as food, but also ensures that this environment will continue to be hospitable by stimulating the release of those hormones which releasing those hormones which will keep the uterus hospitable. So this is another view of in the implanted embryo here, and you can see that now it has created some sort of a pit here, and in the pit there is a soup out to which it gets implanted. Another view of the same, day 8, a day or two after the process of implantation began, and you find that in this pit, it is now firmly planted, and this is that soup which has formed as a result of breakdown of cells and all the material here. So that has formed this soup which will nourish as well as make those hormones. A day further, day 9, further development along the same lines, and day 12, still further development along the same lines. You can find that now it is further deeper down, and you have surrounded by this soup. And now just sort of recap, why is there no menstruation during pregnancy? Because the hormones that keep the uterus intact and ready for the baby continue to be produced. And these hormones continue to be produced because of a hormone called the human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, which acts like the luteinizing hormone. Now this HCG is produced in this soup that we were talking about. And the pregnancy test depends upon the presence of this human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, in the urine. It can be detected in the urine in pregnancy tests 4 weeks after the last menstrual period. And as you would recollect, the egg is released from the ovary about 2 weeks after the last menstrual period. So, but the woman comes to know that she might be pregnant only when she misses a period. And therefore, the date which is known with some certainty by the woman is the date on which she had her last period, so last menstrual period. And 2 weeks after that, probably she became pregnant. And 4 weeks after that, we can detect it. So which means when we are able to detect, the embryo is about 2 weeks old. So the embryo has been growing for about 2 weeks. It got implanted about a week before that. So it takes 1 week to get implanted. So it has been implanted a week before, and within 1 week, it's able to produce enough of HCG for it to be detected in the urine. But then this is only a makeshift arrangement. Creating this soup here in this pit is a makeshift arrangement. What will eventually nourish the baby in further development is the formation of the placenta. And that also begins pretty early, around day 16 of the pregnancy, as early as that, although the proper function, full function of the placenta will it will fully take over at about 8 weeks. But the process begins pretty early. So if we look at the sources of nourishment for the baby, we find that there is a whole sequence which right from the beginning. So it comes prepared with its food supply. The egg comes prepared with its food supply even before it has been fertilized. And that's why the egg is so much bigger than the sperm, because the sperm is basically the nucleus which will fertilize. But the egg not only has that nucleus as in any cell, the egg also has a considerable amount of food stored within, so that after fertilization, it will be able to live on that for a couple of days. And then in the surroundings, which it finds in the fallopian tube, again, there are secretions, that is juices made by the fallopian tube, which will be able to nourish it up to day 3. And then after the 3rd day, usually it is in the uterus, where the same process will continue, because the uterus also has secretions, which will be able to nourish it up to the 1st week. And after that, as it gets implanted, it will create that juice by digesting some cells of the uterus. And this can continue to nourish it up to the 8th week. But the placenta also starts contributing to this nourishment from the 3rd week onwards. And by the 8th week, the placenta can take over completely. So you can see that there is a very elaborate planning here, anticipating what will be enough only for a short period and can therefore serve only as a makeshift arrangement. And in anticipation of that source becoming inadequate, the next source is already getting prepared. Here's a diagrammatic picture of the placenta. Now, here on this side is the uterus. That is the uterine wall, which is the mother's part. And this is the placenta, and the uterine cavity in which is the fetus, that is the baby. Now, we can look at it from either end. Let's start with, say, the mother's end. Just as the mother is sending an artery to every part of the body, it is also sending arteries to the uterus. And a few branches of this uterine artery, that is, which is supplying blood to the uterus, enter the placenta. And as from any other organ, after giving up some oxygen and picking up carbon dioxide and other waste products, the blood leaves the placenta in the uterine vein. Now, the baby also has arteries and veins. And just as the baby is sending arteries to every part of the body, the baby is also sending through the umbilical artery blood into this umbilical artery, that is the artery passing through the umbilical cord, that rope-like structure that connects the fetus to the mother. So it is through this umbilical cord that this umbilical artery finally enters the placenta. And then out comes the umbilical vein after picking up some oxygen and giving up some carbon dioxide. So you can see that this artery is not actually giving up oxygen, it is collecting oxygen. And this is something like what happens in the lungs. That is, the pulmonary artery goes to the lungs and picks up oxygen and gives up carbon dioxide. So for the fetus, this umbilical artery, and it's passing through the placenta, is doing something similar to what happens in the lungs. So the placenta is serving as the lungs of the baby. It is through this blood that is passing through the placenta that oxygen is picked up and carbon dioxide given up, other waste products given up, and nourishment like glucose also is picked up. So nourishment like glucose getting picked up is something similar to what happens in the gastrointestinal tract. So the placenta is also working like the gastrointestinal tract of the baby. And besides carbon dioxide, other waste products are also given up here, sent into the mother's blood. So this placenta is also working like the kidneys for the baby. So it's a 3-in-1 structure for the baby, at least a 3-in-1. It has a fourth function also, which we shall come to, that is manufacturing hormones. So what this placenta is doing is providing a thin membrane, a membrane or a partition, which is allowing an extremely free passage of gases and nutrients and waste products. And the result is that when these two blood vessels, and here the surface is folded again to increase the surface area, this point at which this thin partition, which allows freely the passage of oxygen, carbon dioxide, waste products, and nutrients like glucose, across this exchange takes place from the mother to the fetal blood, so far as oxygen nourishment is concerned, and the other way, that is carbon dioxide and waste products from the fetal blood into the mother's blood. And that's how when the blood returns to the fetus through this umbilical vein, this has more oxygen than the blood that entered, less carbon dioxide, more glucose, and less of waste products like urea. So this is sort of the triple function of the placenta, acting as the lungs, the gastrointestinal tract, as well as the kidneys of the fetus. And this it can continue. This is a function that it can continue to serve till the end of pregnancy. The structure is big enough and has enough capacity to take care of these needs till the very end of pregnancy. The other arrangements before that were only makeshift arrangements till the placenta could be formed. And the placenta also starts forming quite early, around the 16th day, and is fully ready by the 8th week. And it's only after the 8th week that we call the baby not an embryo, but a fetus, because by the 8th week, it starts looking a bit like a human being. It's differentiated enough to have the features of a human being, and then we call it the fetus. So the functions of the placenta are to act as the lungs, the intestines or the gut, and the kidneys of the fetus. Apart from that, it produces a number of hormones. One of those we have already talked about, the human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. That stimulates the corpus luteum, just like the luteinizing hormone. So it acts like LH. It stimulates the corpus luteum, and as a result, the corpus luteum will continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone, which will maintain the uterus in good shape, and in fact, make it further ready for supporting the fetus in that uterine environment. And the placenta itself also produces the same hormones, so that it will be able to take over that function also completely. It manufactures estrogen, which enlarges the uterus, the breasts, and relaxes some ligaments. Ligaments, are structures with a very high tensile strength. They can stand a great deal of pull, and we'll talk more about them when we come to the bones and joints. But these, are across joints, and they stabilize the joints. But then here, this is a situation in which some relaxation of these ligaments is necessary for the baby to be able to get out when the time for delivery comes. And that is something that the estrogen does during pregnancy. The large amounts of estrogen that are eventually secreted by the placenta, far more than what corpus luteum was able to secrete. And then progesterone, which is in fact the hormone that lets the pregnancy go on. By inhibiting uterine contraction. It relaxes the uterus, doesn't let it contract, because contraction would mean the baby that is growing, that might be thrown out. And that's why in a woman who has repeated abortions, one of the things that is given from outside is progesterone, because that will continue, that will help the continuation of the pregnancy by inhibiting the uterine contraction. It thickens the uterine wall, not just making the bed softer, but also serving on the bed food to the baby. And that's, the blood vessels also multiply, they become thicker and tortuous, and then glands which would secrete the necessary secretions. And it acts also outside the uterus, preparing the breast for milk secretion. So estrogens and progesterone and other hormones are contributing in different ways to make the breasts ready for lactation, which will be required soon after delivery, immediately after delivery. So that process also continues. Estrogen sort of equip the breast with the nuts and the bolts, and progesterone sort of further equips the factory, assembles those nuts and bolts to make the factory production ready. And there will be other hormones which will come in to actually start the milk production. And one of those is this hormone manufactured in the placenta, human chorionic somatomamotropin, HCS. It actually kickstarts the production of milk in the factory, which has been assembled by the estrogen and the progesterone. And another thing that HCS does is to decrease glucose utilization in the mother. That is having effects somewhat opposite to those of insulin. We saw that insulin, increases the glucose utilization in the cells and also increases glucose utilization for manufacturing the storage forms such as glycogen. But here, this hormone does the opposite. As a result, the blood glucose levels would go up, because in the mother, the glucose utilization has become more difficult, and it is not being sufficiently stored as the surplus glucose is not being stored as glycogen. So the mother's blood glucose level would go up, and a higher level of blood glucose in the blood that is now passing through the placenta and giving up its glucose to the fetus, that higher level will ensure that more of glucose will be able to pass to the baby. Now, while this is very good, it also means that the mother has a higher blood glucose level. It still stays within the normal limits, but it creates that tendency in a susceptible woman to actually get diabetes. And that's how one can get gestational diabetes, that is diabetes of pregnancy, which reverses itself when all these, when factors like this disappear and the woman is back to normal. But development of diabetes during pregnancy is a warning that the woman is at a higher risk for developing diabetes later in life. She is at a higher risk as compared to others who did not develop this type of a diabetes during pregnancy. And therefore, what it means is that this woman, by adopting a healthier lifestyle, might be able to delay considerably the expression of this diabetes in later life. Because it's diabetes, it's basically a tendency. It's a tendency to develop diabetes, and this tendency can express itself at different stages in life depending upon the lifestyle. And if by adopting a healthy lifestyle, the person is able to delay it to the age of, say, 80, then it's as good as not getting diabetes. So this is a sort of a warning. And therefore, one should get the blood glucose tests done periodically during pregnancy. And another hormone that the placenta manufactures is relaxin. And as the name indicates, it relaxes the uterus, as does progesterone. This also relaxes the uterus so that it will not contract prematurely and the baby will be able to stay undisturbed. It will not try to throw out the guest. And it relaxes the ligaments in preparation for the delivery so that the delivery will be easier. Now, this is how the embryo looks at 44 days. It's still called an embryo, not yet the fetus. Fetus, we call it after the 8th week, that is after about 56 days. Now, this may be a right point to talk about morning sickness, because morning sickness typically appears around this time and may continue throughout the first trimester, that is the first 1/3 of the pregnancy, the first 12 weeks or so. And although it's called morning sickness, it doesn't necessarily happen only in the mornings. And it consists of a feeling of nausea and vomiting. The woman may not actually vomit, but it's an unpleasant feeling, and it can occur several times in the day, not only in the morning, but also later in the day. And in some cases, it may be more severe and she may actually vomit. And sometimes it can be so severe as to lead to dehydration. And that is when it needs more attention. But this is something which passes off and vanishes on its own after about 2 months. It starts about a month after the missed period and vanishes after about 2 months and occurs in about 70% of women. So it can be considered essentially normal. Consists of nausea, a feeling as if the woman feels as if I might vomit, and sometimes actually vomits, and may occur at any time of the day. Another thing that a woman might notice in the first trimester is passing urine more often. And but at the same time, this disappears in the second trimester. This happens in the first trimester because the growing uterus starts pressing on the bladder, and therefore the bladder pressure goes up more frequently, and therefore the woman passes urine more frequently. Whereas, and in the second trimester, it disappears because by then the uterus has grown up so big that it is risen above the level of the bladder and therefore doesn't press on the bladder anymore. But it may press on the intestines and may lead to constipation. So she passes urine more often due to pressure of the uterus on the urinary bladder. And the symptoms disappear in the second trimester when the uterus becomes so big that it rises above the level of the bladder. Now we move further, almost the 8th week, 52 days, and you can see a remarkable resemblance with the human being. And this is at 13 weeks, still more human looking. Now, in the first trimester, there's frequency of urination and morning sickness. Any problems in the second trimester? In the second trimester, which is the most comfortable trimester, several yogasanas can be safely done. However, the only problems might be constipation, which can be taken care of generally by an adequate diet, at the most supplementing it with some isabgol. And if this constipation is not cared for, piles might develop because of repeatedly, straining at the stool that reduces sort of that compromises the return of blood from the rectum to the heart, and therefore these blood vessels swell up and might lead to piles. There's a fetus at 26 weeks. Now, let's look at the hormones of pregnancy, because now we are getting closer to delivery, and how does that happen? Now, this is the human chorionic gonadotropin, which comes from that soup. And when the placenta takes over, then the placenta continues to secrete this HCG, but then gradually it drops. And these are the estrogen and the progesterone levels, which keep rising to levels far above that what happens in the non-pregnant state. And these are also coming from the placenta during all this period. But then near the full term, that is near the 40th week, you find that the progesterone level particularly, that is the hormone which was inhibiting the uterine contraction, the hormone that was keeping the uterus relaxed, the hormone that was leaving the baby undisturbed, not trying to expel it, that hormone starts coming down. And this is one of the things that might contribute to the delivery. Now, before we go to delivery itself, a few tips for pregnancy about sleep. How much sleep does a pregnant woman need? Generally longer than in the non-pregnant state. She needs about 10 hours of sleep in a day. But at the same time, if she finds it difficult to fall asleep, she should not take sleeping pills because it could be harmful to the baby. Not only sleeping pills, any drugs, even painkillers, should be not taken except when prescribed. So, as a rule of the thumb, a pregnant woman should not take any drugs except when prescribed by a doctor. Diet. And since the mother has to support also the growth of the baby, she does need extra food. And as a rule of the thumb, about 10 to 15% more per day than in the non-pregnant state. But does this extra food have to be in the form of some special foods? Not necessarily. No special diet is really necessary because the percentage of energy that should come from proteins stays essentially constant. So what was able to provide enough protein, the type of foods that were able to provide enough protein before pregnancy, will be able to provide enough protein also during pregnancy if taken in a larger amount. Because if you take more of the same foods, we get also more of protein. We get more of everything that is there in that food. And that is generally quite enough, which means that as anybody else in a healthy diet, this pregnant woman should also take a diet, the staple of which is a combination of cereals and pulses. And these cereals and pulses should be in the form of whole grains as much as possible, not refined grains. And along with that, she should also take a moderate amount of judiciously chosen fat and enough of fruits and vegetables, 4 to 5 helpings a day, and milk and milk products in moderation, and spices in moderation. So the general principles remain essentially the same as for any healthy person. But the quantity has to be increased, and the quantity has to be greater during lactation than even during pregnancy, because the baby is now of a bigger size, and for the first 6 months, through the mother's milk, the baby is being entirely nourished by the mother. So the mother is nourishing the baby even after pregnancy for the first 6 months if she breastfeeds the baby, and therefore the requirements during lactation are even greater than during pregnancy. Around 300 calories extra per day during pregnancy, and about 500 to 600 calories extra during lactation. And to quite some extent, the body weight and the feeling of hunger will be able to guide the woman as to how much extra to take. And since constipation can be a problem during pregnancy in the second and the third trimester, that may need attention. And the one can supplement the diet apart from taking whole grains and fruits and vegetables and plenty of water. This can also be supplemented with isabgol. But otherwise, no special diet is really necessary. And at the same time, no major restrictions are called for either. During morning sickness, it is helpful if the woman avoids heavy and spicy foods and takes small, frequent meals. Because a heavy meal, even if it is not made of heavy foods or fried foods, a heavy meal itself will make the woman feel worse, feel more nauseated, and feel more like vomiting. There can be some cravings during pregnancy, and these may be catered to. By and large, they're quite harmless. And since adequate nourishment of the mother and the baby is important, and particularly limiting are things like iron and folic acid and calcium and so on, these are often prescribed as supplements, and to be on the safe side, they may be taken in the doses that are prescribed, not mega doses, not too much of an excess, but in the doses that are prescribed, they can be taken And one can also opt for Ayurvedic advice, which also has a lot of value to it and may take care of some of these supplements during pregnancy. And also, there are formulations available in Ayurveda which will facilitate delivery, which will improve the supply of milk during lactation. So all those things are also available also in Ayurveda. So this is some of the things we about the diet during pregnancy. If a woman does not take enough food during pregnancy, the baby does not suffer much because the baby acts like a parasite. From whatever is available, it will extract enough nourishment for itself. The mother suffers more than the baby because of malnutrition. And this again is important because suppose there is calcium deficiency, the baby may get enough calcium, but the woman ends up with weaker bones, which will be impossible to strengthen later on because, once calcium has been removed from the bones, you cannot deposit it back easily. And therefore, the woman will become more vulnerable to fractures. If the woman does not get enough iron, the baby will be able to extract enough iron for itself, but the woman will get anemic at the end of pregnancy. And therefore, that she'll feel extremely weak. And therefore, even the effort delivery will become more difficult. So in general, the mother suffers more than the baby. And for the health of both, which are both important, it's important to pay attention to the diet and take the extra amount that is really needed. There may be sometimes some thing to be done, because if the woman is feeling nauseated, feeling like vomiting, then there may be certain types of foods which are not fried foods, not heavy in that sense, but which are a little calorie dense. That might help because in a smaller volume, they are able to provide more calories, things like say nuts. So that is the why, this traditional advice of giving some nuts to the pregnant woman does make some sense. But apart from this sort of a rationale based on common sense, a special diet, especially for pregnancy, is not really necessary. How about yogic practices during pregnancy? Here, the advice is highly variable. It varies from one extreme, which is highly conservative, that is, don't do any yogic practices during pregnancy. From that to the other end, that is, you can do every yogic practice during pregnancy. You'll find all types of advice, depending upon the person who is giving that advice, what type of personal bias that person has. So the advice on yogic practices is extremely variable and covers that entire spectrum from no yogic practices at all to almost every yogic practice. But sort of to find the golden mean, here are a few suggestions, but then this is not the right time to talk about this in detail. That we shall take up in the next course, Yes.04. But just to give a little introduction here, it is the second semester which is the safest. In the first trimester, sorry, not semester, it should be trimester. Semester is in schools and colleges, 6-month period. This is a trimester, which is a 3-month period. So it is the second trimester which is the safest. Sorry for that mistake there. It is the second trimester which is the safest. In the first trimester, many yogic practices may increase the risk of an abortion. And in the third trimester, the abdomen is too unwieldy for some of the yogic practices. It is the second trimester that is the safest. In general, the postures to be avoided during pregnancy are the inverted postures, again, common sense. Abdominal twists, no intense contraction of the abdomen should take place, as in the boat pose, and certainly no Surya Namaskar. And as the abdomen grows bigger in size, particularly in the second trimester, one may use pillows to neutralize the effect of the large abdomen. Some of the yogic practices which may be done are the hip opening postures like Supta Baddha Konasana. Now, Supta Baddha Konasana is essentially like the butterfly pose. In the loosening, we do sometimes that butterfly movement. In the sitting posture, something like that, so posture like the beginning of the butterfly movement can be adopted also in the lying down position. And that is what's called Supta Baddha Konasana. and that opens up the hips. Among the pranayamas, alternate nostril breathing can be done throughout pregnancy, helps in balancing the autonomic nervous system, keeps the woman relaxed, Anulom Vilom pranayam. And no Kapalabhati in the third trimester. And most important, listen to your body. You would know what is right for you and what is not right. And yogic practices are in general easier during the second pregnancy than in the first one. Second pregnancy in general, in every respect, is easier than the first one, both because of the experience and because the body has been somewhat prepared for the next pregnancy. And the complicated pregnancies might require strict bed rest, and then, of course, the yogic practices are out. For example, placenta previa. When the placenta, instead of developing on the side, develops at a place from where it can be easily detached. So in those cases, disturbance of the uterus is not desirable, and therefore the woman may need bed rest rather than yogic practices. Now, all this discussion was basically to remove this notion, which is also quite common, that all yogic practices are banned during pregnancy. That's an extremely conservative view based more on ignorance and personal prejudice rather than on facts. Because there are several studies which have shown that, in fact, yogic practices can be very helpful. They can make delivery more comfortable and easier. And they also give mental relaxation, which is important. And they also give an opportunity for a loving and sacred communication with the baby. So when the woman is trying to connect with the divine, is chanting some mantras during the practice, that also gets communicated to the baby, and she can do it consciously. With this, we shall return in a moment again. Now, when to expect delivery? The way we can calculate the expected date of delivery is by starting with the date of the last menstrual period. Add to that 9 months and 1 week. For example, if the last menstrual period was on the 5th of March, the expected date of delivery is 12th December. So 5th of March, the 3rd month, add to that 9 months, the 12th month, and 1 week, that's 7 to 5, 12th December. And usually delivery takes place within plus minus 1 week of the expected date of delivery. What leads to the delivery is a combination of mechanical factors and hormonal changes. One doesn't know exactly everything that is responsible for delivery, but these are the two things which are quite obvious and they contribute. The mechanical factors are the stretching of the uterus, and the hormonal changes are, on one hand, the withdrawal of hormones like progesterone particularly, and to some extent estrogen. These hormones, their level comes down, and instead comes in another hormone, oxytocin, which is released from the posterior pituitary, and that leads to contraction of the uterus. Progesterone relaxes the uterus. Oxytocin leads to contraction of the uterus. Now, labor pains. Labor pains are amongst the most severe pains experienced in good health, because a woman is basically, a pregnant woman is healthy. She's not sick. She's going through a normal physiological process. And in good health, this is one of the severest pains experienced. And anyone who has seen a woman in labor in the hospital, and all medical students have seen that, the person cannot help feeling extremely grateful to its mother, to his or her mother. To start with, the labor pains are mild. The duration is about 30 seconds at a time. The uterus contracts, remains in a state of spasm for half a minute or so, and this repeats itself every 10 to 30 minutes. As time passes, they get more severe, they last longer and become more frequent. At the end of the first stage is from the onset of labor, that is the beginning of the first pains, till the full dilatation of the cervix of the uterus. During the first stage, at the end of the first stage, the duration of the pains is about 1 minute at a time, every 3 to 5 minutes. And how long does the first stage last? The first stage lasts longer in the first pregnancy, usually 12 to 24 hours. In subsequent pregnancy, the range could be from 6 to 8 hours and sometimes even less. Some women deliver very easily and quickly. So that is the duration of the first stage. And in the second stage, the woman needs bearing down efforts, and that is when the baby gets delivered. Second stage is the delivery of the baby, and the third stage is the delivery of the placenta. There is a story about a man who was driving his wife down a long distance, about 200 kilometers or something. The hospital was far away from where they stayed, and he was driving his car very fast to take his pregnant wife, who had gone into labor pains. He was trying to drive as fast as possible to get to the hospital. And he was getting anxious how long it will be before the baby is actually delivered, and it shouldn't happen in the car. So he was talking to the doctor, and the doctor asked, how frequent are the pains? Because you can see that the frequency keeps going up as one proceeds from the in beginning to the end of the first stage. From 10 to 30 minutes, they occur every 3 to 5 minutes. So he was driving at 120 kilometers an hour, and he said, well, it seems she's getting pains after every 2 kilometers. It took one episode of pain every 2 kilometers. That's the way he was trying to sort of communicate the frequency of the labor pains. Now coming to the delivery itself. Now in the delivery, there are hormonal factors like withdrawal of the estrogen and progesterone and release of oxytocin, which contracts the uterus. Apart from that, the stretch itself stimulates contraction, and here there's a positive feedback mechanism at work. The stretch of the uterus stimulates contraction of the uterus. The contraction reduces the space available and therefore increases the stretch, and this increased stretch stimulates further contraction. So you can see there's a positive feedback mechanism at work. And this takes place at many points in reproduction. We saw it happening in case of the menstrual cycle at one point, the positive feedback. And this is another point where this positive feedback occurs. And we'll see this positive feedback again occurring during lactation. So anyway, now coming back to this delivery process, here this positive feedback is because stretch leads to contraction, contraction leads to further stretch, and this further stretch leads to further contraction. This type of a positive feedback happens also on the path of yoga. Just like labor pains, there is a painful process, a difficult process of sadhana in yoga. And like the labor pains, again, it's an enjoyable pain. Looks contradictory, but then here, the woman is doing it for the love of the child. And in yoga, you do it for the love of the divine. And therefore, in spite of the difficulties involved, it feels good. And as here, over there also, there's a positive feedback. As the effort continues, the person experiences more and more of joy and peace in life. And as the person experiences more joy and peace, the encouragement for putting in further effort, for continuing on the journey increases. So again, there is a positive feedback at work. And in a way like this delivery, in the process of yoga also, the person keeps getting delivered again and again from his previous ignorant state to a less ignorant state. So it's in a way rebirth taking place all the time on the path of yoga as well. One is dying to one's old self and getting born to a new self, becoming a different type of person, being born to a different type of human being. Now, this is a little more realistic picture of the delivery. This is at the end of the first stage when the cervix is fully dilated and the head can be accommodated there. In the second stage, the head has come out and the rest of the baby will be soon out. And in the third stage, it is only the placenta left inside to be delivered. Now coming to the influences on the baby inside the mother's womb. The mother, while talking to some women in Japan, told them that true maternity begins with the conscious creation of a being, with the willed shaping of a soul coming to develop and utilize a new body. So it is not just a sort of a biological process to be gone through. It's a process of conscious creation, creating a new human being, putting one's consciousness into the process. And one can, by doing that, will what type of a child would be born. And this is important because the children are the future. And to some extent, the type of child that we bring forth is the type of future that the world will have. And Sri Aurobindo in the Mother's Vision, as you know, is highly futuristic, that we are poised for the next leap in evolution, which will essentially be the result of a higher level of consciousness. And therefore, this is important because it is possible for the mother to create a baby which has a higher level of consciousness and a greater potential for developing the consciousness further during life. The mother has that opportunity. Now, this might look a little unscientific and weird, but in fact, all creation is only a manifestation of the same supreme consciousness of the divine. And therefore, any one mode of consciousness can influence another mode of consciousness. For example, the mind is one mode of consciousness, the body another. The mind is a subtle mode and the body is a gross mode, but the mind can affect the body. There's a mind-body relationship. And in the same way, the mother's mind and the baby's mind and body are also expressions of the same consciousness. And being so intimately in contact, it is only to be expected that the mother's mind will be able to influence the baby's mind and also the body. One might say that the body is not very plastic, and the body in any case will take the type of shape as it dictated by the genes. But the mother talks of a story where once a woman came to her with a daughter who was not only extremely good looking, but she resembled the painting of a child by the well-known British painter Joshua Reynolds. It seems Joshua Reynolds was fond of making pictures of children. And what the woman said was, when the mother told her that this child looks exactly like a painting, I think, by Reynolds, the child's mother said that, will you believe it, that throughout pregnancy, I had in front of me a painting by Reynolds, which had a beautiful child. And I would keep wishing, particularly all the time, particularly in the morning as when I got up, and at night before I went to bed, I would pray for my child to look as beautiful as this. And true enough, when the child was born, it looked like that painting. Now, if the body, which is so resistant to any uh, change, a body which doesn't have the type of plasticity which the mind has, if the body can be affected to that extent, why not the mind? And therefore, one can influence the uh, consciousness of the child, which will be expressed through the type of the mind that the child has by the mother wishing, willing, and willing it. And that's why when we're talking of yogic practice, as I said, that is also an opportunity for a conscious and sacred communication with the baby. Just to give you a sample of Reynolds paintings, there's a very large number of them available on the net. I just picked up 2 samples. I don't know which of these that woman was looking at who gave birth to a baby looking like one of these paintings. But as you can see, that these are beautiful pictures. And Reynolds, it seems, was very fond of drawing children in his paintings, and that's why we have such a large number available. And this, in fact, became a controversial issue in 2017, about 5 years ago, when the Central Council for Research on Yoga and Naturopathy came up with a booklet providing some guidance to pregnant women. And in that, the booklet said, among other things, that the woman should be careful about her thoughts and feelings during pregnancy, have positive thoughts and positive feelings, and also that she should avoid non-vegetarian food. And then, the uh, newspaper, after talking to some doctors, said that this is all rubbish. The mother's mind can't influence the baby, and the mother should not give up non-vegetarian food because she needs extra protein during pregnancy, and therefore her nutrition will suffer if she takes uh, only vegetarian food. Now, doctors are experts, but expertise in one area does not necessarily make the person an expert in another area, and therefore does not authorize that person to give opinions on an area about which he is ignorant. By and large, medical students don't learn all these things in medical school. And therefore, it's understandable that the doctors whom they talked to were quite ignorant about these things. And about nutrition also, although it may come to the general public as a surprise, about nutrition also doctors learn very little in the medical course all over the world. And therefore, to say that non-vegetarian food will be important because the woman needs more protein also is not very surprising. But the fact is, as I told you, that if the woman takes that additional quantity of food, the protein requirements will take care of itself, because more food of the type that a healthy person should in any case take will provide enough protein, and this can come from a vegetarian diet. A vegetarian diet is quite adequate for providing enough protein, both in quantity and quality. And when it comes to the mother's mind influencing the baby, we'll not go into mythological tales which talk about it. I'll go instead to some experiments done in the premier institute of the country, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. I was not a part of those experiments, but I know those experiments in which one of my colleagues from our department and one from anatomy were both involved. And what they did was to play music to the chicks growing inside fertilized eggs. So they had a control group for which that music was not played. The chick takes about 21 days for the egg to hatch and the chick to come out. So during this period, the fertilized eggs were exposed to music in the experimental group and not exposed to music in the control group. It was found that when the chicks were born, the structure of the brain was different in the two groups. So if the structure of the brain can be affected by what the egg or the growing chick in the egg listens to while it is growing up, and brain again is a gross structure. We're not talking about subtle effects on the mind. But if the brain is affected, chances are that the mind would also be affected. But at the gross level, in the brain also, you can demonstrate differences as a result of the type of environment the child experiences, including the music that is played to a growing chick. So if it can happen to a growing chick, why not to a human being? And stimulated by this article in the newspaper, which rubbished what had been published by the Central Council for Research on Yoga and Naturopathy, I wrote a blog, which is still available on Speaking Tree. The title of the blog was, "Does the Mother's Mind Bend the Baby Before It Is Born?" Well, delivery is only the end of the beginning. It is the end of what began 9 months earlier as a bond between the mother and the baby. That bond continues for another at least 6 months, could continue for a year or more through breastfeeding. And that again is important, not only for that bonding to continue, but also for the health of both the baby and the mother. The background for breastfeeding has already been prepared, as we have seen. The capacity to secrete milk has been created through all these hormones, estrogen, progesterone, which are at high levels during pregnancy, and the HCS, which stimulates milk synthesis, like prolactin, And later on, this continues with the help of prolactin. After pregnancy, when HCS will not be available from the placenta, prolactin continues the job. And during pregnancy itself, secretion of milk is inhibited by the same hormones, estrogen and progesterone, which are equipping the breast with uh, getting the factory ready for milk. But same time, the production starts essentially after delivery with the help of prolactin. And then what is produced is sent out of the factory with the help of oxytocin, the hormone that is released from the posterior pituitary. And for oxytocin to be released, what is needed is a reflex which is initiated by the baby bringing its mouth in contact with its mother's breast. So that stimulates both the emotional as well as, you can say, the sensory component of the reflex. And the result is that that oxytocin is released from pituitary, and then that leads to a contraction of those little tubes, ducts in the breast, which will expel the milk out of the breast. And as the milk is expelled, the baby experiences the taste, the baby enjoys it, and it clings more fondly to the breast. And when it clings more fondly, this reflex gets stimulated further. Its mother enjoys it, and the reflex is further stimulated, and that releases more oxytocin, more milk is expelled. And this goes on till the baby feels full. When it feels full, it shows some disinterest, and when it shows disinterest, starts moving away, and removal of this contact with the breast starts shutting out of this reflex, so that then further milk will not flow for very long. So that is how, again, there's a positive feedback at work. The release of the milk makes the baby cling harder, better, more warmly, and that in turn releases still more oxytocin. So, and more oxytocin, more milk, further contact. So this is a positive feedback till it is necessary. And and oxytocin, of course, is a hormone present not only in women but also in men, and serves a similar purpose. It serves in both men and women the purpose of bonding. In other relationships also, it has been shown that a hug can release a lot of oxytocin. Now, some more related things. Prolactin, the hormone that stimulates the synthesis of milk during lactation, inhibits the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And we saw the other day that this gonadotropin releasing hormone is important for stimulating the secretion of FSH and LH from the ovary, which keeps the menstrual cycle running. Now, because of this inhibition, the ovaries remain inactive. The breast is active, but the ovaries are inactive, and therefore there's no menstruation during lactation, and there's no ovulation during lactation. And even after lactation, the cycles may remain anovulatory, that is, without shedding an egg for about 6 months. So, nutritionally speaking, at least 6 months of breastfeeding is required, but longer doesn't do any harm so long as we supplement breastfeeding after 6 months of age with supplements. And there are traditional sort of cultures in which breastfeeding continues even up to 5 years of age, till the baby is 5. That may be a little on the higher side, but 1 to 1.5 years of breastfeeding is not at all abnormal. So 1 to 1.5 years of breastfeeding, plus another 6 years when the cycles may start but still remain without shedding an egg gives an automatic inbuilt spacing out of 2 babies, which means 2 babies are unlikely to be born less than 2 years apart. So a 2-year gap between 2 babies is more or less built in, so long as one feeds the baby for about 1.5 years after birth, which will be good for the baby, making it healthier. Breastfeeding has been found repeatedly now to be better than bottle feeding in many respects. Bottle feeding, basically has a few important handicaps. Firstly, it's very expensive. Bottle feeding is expensive, and therefore many who take to bottle feeding cannot afford it in the right amount. And therefore they dilute the formula more than is proper. And the result is that the child gets malnourished. Secondly, many of the poor families which may take to bottle feeding because it is fashionable, fortunately, it's no longer fashionable. But when it was fashionable, many poor families took to it because they thought it will probably be better because the rich people do it. They cannot afford refrigerators, and therefore the milk becomes unhygienic. They give also the leftover formula feed to the baby, which gets spoilt because of no refrigeration, and the baby keeps repeatedly getting attacks of diarrhea. And the third reason why breastfeeding is better than bottle feeding is that breast milk has a characteristic composition, a composition which is optimum for the baby. And no amount of tinkering with other milks or manufacturing a formula which is as close to breast milk as possible has been successful. So essentially, all efforts to mimic and copy completely human breast milk have been frustrating. None of these efforts has been totally successful. And therefore, for all these reasons, it is considered that breastfeeding is far better than bottle feeding. And on top of that, built into this breastfeeding is also a mechanism for spacing out the interval between two children, which also is really required for the baby to be well cared for. So for providing good care to the baby, it's important that the child does not have to face another sibling for the first 2 years of its life. And if the baby is breastfed for about 1.5 years, that interval will be between two babies will be automatically ensured. Not only that, it does something also for the baby. Repeated release of oxytocin would contract the uterus, as happens during delivery. It contracts the uterus also after delivery. And this helps the uterus get smaller so that it gets back to its normal pre-pregnant size much faster. And this is something which all women want to happen. They want the tummy to get to the same size as it was before. And oxytocin helps in that. So that's also something which lactation does, because lactation means repeated release of oxytocin every time the woman breastfeeds the baby. Well, all this really should not be very necessary. And the love that a mother has for the baby is instinctive. In fact, in the ordinary world, maternal love comes closer to divine love than any other type of love. It is unconditional. It does not expect anything in return like divine love. The only way it differs from divine love is it is not universal. It is for a specific baby. So it's not universal in character, but it has the other two important characteristics of divine love. It is unconditional, and it does not expect anything in return. Suggested reading: this popular book, The Human Machine. These two textbooks, Fundamentals of Physiology and Understanding Medical Physiology. And plenty of pictures in this presentation, and most of them were taken from Tortora and Grabowski. Principles of Anatomy and Physiology, 10th edition. Gratitude to the mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And a big thank you to all the mothers of the world, some of whom are likely to be present in this session right now, and many more would probably watch it later. Any questions?
I have a question. Usually in US, there's an option. You can save the the cord blood or the tissue after the baby is born. Can you talk a little bit about it and how is that useful for the baby?
Yes, long-term preservation, I think you're talking about.
Yes.
Cryopreservation, preservation at extremely low temperatures. As we were talking, to start with, the baby starts with an undifferentiated cell, which has the potential for forming any part of the body. And then in the process of development, the cells differentiate so that they get committed to forming the intestines or the liver or the brain or the lungs, and they get differentiated. But in the cord blood, there are cells available which are still quite primitive. And therefore, these are the stem cells, that is the starting cells which have a vast potential, and they have come from the baby. And therefore, these cells might be able to differentiate into various organs. Another thing, therefore, what is sort of being attempted in these is that these cells may later on be useful in replacing diseased organs which have become unserviceable, and there is no other cure available. So instead of a transplant from another person, one may be able to create that organ from these stem cells, if they are provided the right environment in the person's body in that particular organ, that it is likely to develop into an organ of that type, get differentiated, because the potential is there. We'll talk a little more about some of these things in the next session, where we see that while these cells, like the intestinal cells or the lung cells or the kidney cells, they look so different from one another, there is one basic similarity which they all have. And that basic similarity is in the nucleus. That they have the same number of chromosomes, same type of chromosomes, and therefore the genetic blueprint is exactly the same in all of them. Why they look different is because only a small part of this genetic potential is expressed in each cell. So the part expressed is different, the rest is repressed. And in a cell in which there is no differentiation that has taken place, not much is being expressed, but at the same time, the potential for expressing one type of potential or the other exists. These are what we call stem cells. And that's why stem, because they're starting cells like a seed. So the seed has the potential for developing into a flower as well as a leaf. But right now, it is just a seed. In the same way, the cell has all types of potential available, and we just have to provide the right environment in the body, and it is likely to develop into that type of a cell. Express that part of the genetic makeup, which will make it differentiate along those lines. This sort of is the basic principle behind this type of efforts. Ethical issues involved in it, spiritual issues involved in it are another story. But all the same, I mean, that is the basic scientific principle.
Okay, and one follow-up question. So can that stem cell be used by the baby and anybody in the family, any family members? Is that
theoretically, I think it should be possible, because greater the genetic similarity, greater the possibility it can be used by somebody else, just as transplants amongst those who have similar genetic makeup are easier than amongst unrelated people.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
There are no questions in the chat box, so in case anybody would like to unmute and ask, they can ask. And then it seems we don't have more questions, so we can close today's session and meet for the next session on Monday. Thank you, everyone. We end with a moment of silence.